Okay, so today we are going to talk about framework for a little while. And normally when I give this lecture, it takes a lot longer than an hour. So there are going to be some parts of this that are a little bit sparse. I apologize for that in advance, just for the sake of trying to make sure that we cover everything that really needs to be covered in this topic. And I'll leave some time for questions at the end, but if I don't get to your question, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to talk more as much as you all need. So framework is kind of this idea that the affirmative should have to defend an instantiation of the resolution. It's very similar to topicality. A lot of people use those terms interchangeably. I truthfully don't know what the difference is, so you can just call it topicality if you want, but it's a bit more complicated because it is designed to be read against a team that does not defend an instantiation of the resolution. So someone who is purposefully not talking about the resolution in the kind of normative way that we normally do in debate. But importantly, as kind of a subset of that, it's important to know that framework is really about a model of how debate should work. So framework is about a model of debate. So it's never really only just about one particular debate. It's never just about the debate that you are in. Like, you should also make it about the debate that you're in, obviously, this particular affirmative, but it is kind of more broad than that. It's about how all debates should be looking, right? And your position on the negative is that all debates should look as that the AF defends an instantiation of a topical policy action. So that's really what framework is. We're going to focus primarily on impacts and the topical version here because I think that's the most important part of framework, but I'll briefly begin with some discussion of the interpretation level. And I say it's pretty brief because truthfully it tends to be the least important part of framework because for two reasons. One, most non-topical teams tend to not even counter-define many arguments or defend a real substantial we meet argument. This is not always true. There are some teams that are like pretty successful at going for this strategy, in which case, you need to get into that definition debate, obviously. But for the most part, by and large, most non-topical teams just don't even bother dealing with that. They'll just kind of go for an impact turn or say that your model of debate is a bad one. The second reason is that really, like, if you read interpretations of words in the resolution and then you defend that those are, those tend to be the kind of normal understanding of what these words mean. And so most judges are intrinsically on board with those definitions, right? So United States federal government being the three branches in DC, for example, is a pretty common thing that most people believe to be true. And so it's a lot easier to win that interpretation. And so you generally don't have to spend a whole lot of time doing interpretation, the we need, counter interpretation, those kinds of things. You'll need to focus more of your time in terms of impacts, which we'll talk about those now. I think that there are only two impacts to framework that make sense, which is limits or fairness, and then education. There are obviously other impacts that people talk about. I just personally tend to not find those very persuasive, and I'll explain why I don't think they're very persuasive. But if you've got an argument for why you think it's a really great argument, or why it is really persuasive, I'm happy, like, we can talk about that and maybe try and find some middle ground. Maybe you can persuade me, I don't know. But we'll start with limits. I will consistently call this limits, or consistently try to call it limits throughout the rest of this lecture, but really it's fairness. No one in debate really likes the word fairness. There are a lot of problematic connotations associated with that word, especially historically. And so using the word limits is probably the better term to use here. But you should know that what I'm calling limits really is a fairness impact. And you should think about it as really two things. Number one, it is an impact in and of itself, and we'll start there. And then number two, it is also an internal link to education. So number one, limits has to be an impact. Limits, it is an impact in and of itself, because if debate is unfair, how do we debate anymore? How does debate itself function if we don't have kind of a limit, kind of an understanding of the things that we're going to talk about once we walk into the room? It just doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense anymore, right? It becomes debate no longer becomes a debate, but rather kind of a one-way conversation where the affirmative forwards something, which is probably incredibly important, potentially very, very smart and very well detailed and thought out. But if the negative doesn't have anything to say in response, it becomes a one-way conversation, not a debate anymore, right? We can get that in Facebook groups. We can get that in classrooms. We can get that in, if you're my age, going to conferences. You can get that in just like conversations with your friends, but like debate itself doesn't function in the world where we don't have a limit on the topic. So debate itself cannot function in the world where we don't have a limit on the topic. So limits itself has to be an impact, right? And you got to think about it, like, why are people negative if there's no limit? If fairness or limits just don't matter at all, why bother being negative? Why wouldn't we just be affirmative all the time? Right? It's just like all of those kinds of questions point towards the necessity of having limits or fairness. Hey, you all need to remember to mute your mics, please, because I can, thank you. Separate point, but also really important when thinking about limits is that as a judge, judging a debate where there is not a limit is much more difficult and complicated because the norms for judging that we have established and the ways that we try and understand how debate makes sense to us makes a lot less sense in the world where we no longer know exactly what the parameters of the debate are going to be. So, like, for example, when I judge a debate, I always start by the question of, does the affirmative solve the things that it claims to solve? But in the world where, I don't know, an affirmative has stood up and criticized the idea of solvency, right, and has said that shouldn't be a relevant question anymore, we should think about a critique, maybe a problematization of something, right? Then I just sit there when I'm judging and I'm just like, what do I do, right? How do I start deciding? How do I determine what are the kinds of really important things to talk about? And more importantly, how do I determine that in a way that makes me a predictable and a good judge, right? Just the idea of judging itself makes, I think, a lot less sense in the world where we don't have limits, because then the predictable ways that we have come to determine how to judge is a lot more difficult. So limits is an impact in and of itself. And that's kind of like the theory behind what I'm saying. I think there are kind of two ways to go about deploying this theory in a purpose of a framework debate. Number one is what I call nothing links. That's what I call nothing links. And there's three components of this. Number A, little a, one, whatever. The AF tends to be a factually accurate statement about how the world works. This happens all the time where teams, will stand up and be like, the world is anti-Black, vote for us because the world shouldn't be anti-Black anymore. It's like, yes, agreed, the world is anti-Black and it should not be anti-Black anymore. I'm not sure how we garner a link to any off-case argument in that world. We could stand up and we could say the world is not anti-Black, or we could say we should not attempt to solve anti-Blackness, but those are both very problematic positions that no one wants to defend. So when there's not a limit on the topic, then it becomes very difficult to garner a link to any of your off-case or any of your offense arguments. And part two of that is that you can't win without offense, right? Remember, we talked about this in my intro to debate lecture, is that you have to have offense to win, because otherwise you're not proving that the affirmative is a bad idea, which means you have not done your job as the negative, right? So if you don't have offense, if you have not been able to generate an opportunity cost to the affirmative, then you're not going to win the debate, right? So you need to be able to have links. And then the kind of third component of this nothing links argument is that you want to have specific examples of what this looks like. And by that, I mean, you want to have examples that are contextualized to this affirmative that you're debating, like this particular affirmative, as well as arguments that you, broadly speaking, don't get and why you should be able to get those things. So what counterplans and disads don't you get that you should be allowed to read on this topic? And why can you not read those against this affirmative in particular? And oftentimes, Sorry, there's music in the background. I live off of a pretty busy road. Oftentimes, the ground that the affirmative posits you're allowed to read is problematic for you for some reason or other. So, for example, if you're debating an affirmative that is just like straight up Wilderstaff, super Afro-pessimistic, right, and the world burned down civil society, right, you could respond by reading an Afro-optimistic position, right? You could stand up and say, no, actually, the world is not always already totally screwed. Approaching it towards more of an optimistic position is preferable. The affirmative becomes kind of a form of cruel pessimism, and that is problematic. Right, that is like a pretty legitimate response, and that is certainly a debate where you do get an argument that links to what they're saying, but number one, that's not grounded in the resolution, so it's not something you could have predictably prepared. So even if you do start reading that argument, you're probably not going to win anyways, because you haven't really been forced to think about the intricacies of it versus the intricacies of their affirmative. And number two is, depending on who you are, depending on your identity, that might be a really problematic position to take. Like, I am a very, very white person. You could not tell from looking at me. It is problematic for me to stand up and tell Black people, hey, actually, no, you should totally be okay with the way that anti-Blackness works. Right? Like, that's just not okay. It's just like not an okay position to take. And so the ground that they give you oftentimes becomes indefensible. Additionally, that ground oftentimes is what we call concessionary ground. So it's concessionary ground. What that means is that in this particular instance, the AF stood up and said, okay, yeah, you could have totally just read the Cap K against us, forwarded a Marxist understanding of how the world works. But they decided that in this particular moment. If you read Marx, or if you read some kind of Cap K against them, they would say they were always already anti-capitalist, or that they were always already Marxist, and that's not competitive. They would go for a permutation. Right? You can think about the process of reading a disadvantage. So I'll give you a just really odd example. One is that I one time was debating a team who said that we should vote out to create queer communities that embraces toxicity. And like that was their advocacy. We should create queer communities. When I asked them cross-ex if they defended a topical action, they said yes. Yeah, so they were like, yeah, we'll give you a dissent link just because I asked. So suddenly, the creation of queer communities meant that the affirmative also got rid of, meant that I got to read the oil dissent against them, right? Suddenly, now they link to the oil disadvantage, right? And it just like, if you think about it for literally 2 seconds, I have no idea why the creation of queer communities would mean that the United States, broadly speaking, no longer uses oil, right? That just like doesn't make any sense. So like the ground that is given is either absurd or concessionary in the sense that they have said you could have it now, but if you had read it, they would have no-linked it or permuted out of it. So that's the first piece of this impacting of fairness, i.e. this nothing links thing. Number two is what I call the case list. And the case list is about other affirmatives that their interpretation justifies that you should also not have to debate. So if you remember back from the very beginning of this lecture, framework is about a model of how debate should work, right? Framework is a model of how debate should work, which means that if their interpretation allows other non-topical affirmatives to be read, then that is a reason why their interpretation of debate is a bad thing, right? So framework is about setting a good competitive heuristic or a good kind of model for the entire activity, not just this debate in particular, which means that all of your other examples of affirmatives that are allowed under their interpretation are reasons why their interpretation is bad, right? So if they stood up and said, we should be allowed to negate the resolution on the affirmative, and that's their interpretation of how debate should work, then anything that could negate the affirmative meets that interpretation. Sorry, anything that could negate the resolution would meet that interpretation, right? And that's just like a infinitely billion amount of different things. And so give some examples of that, right? Talk about the other kinds of affirmatives that their interpretation justifies that you should not have to debate. Okay. Is everyone on board with this limits argument? Does anyone have any questions about that so far? Okay, I see no hands raised, so we're just going to keep going. So the other impact that I think is pretty persuasive is topic education. As I kind of alluded to before, fairness or limits is also an internal link to this, i.e. that if we can predict what the topic is, predict what we're going to talk about within a debate, then it becomes a lot easier to prepare arguments and kind of get more in depth about each of those different positions. So if we can predictably understand that the affirmative will defend criminal justice reform in one of the three topic areas, then we can develop particular strategies based on those topic areas. And those strategies then require us to do more research and thus learn more about criminal justice reform. Right? So that incentive for research is how fairness is an internal link to topic education. But I think independently of that, topic education itself is an impact that you should read against non-topical affirmatives, because whatever it is that they are talking about is not going to be topic specific in the same sense that what you're talking about. So a lot of non-topical teams will still read affirmatives that are about the topic, right? So like I would bet that abolition will be read as an affirmative, and they'll just say, you know, federal government like can't be trusted for abolition, that is kind of a weak demand on the state, which gets co-opted for various reasons. And so we have to demand abolition outside of the state, right? That would be a non-topical affirmative that you will likely debate this year that is about the topic, but it is not about the intricacies of the topic, if that makes sense. And I will explain what I mean by that. So different criminal justice reform policies are different from each other, right? That's just how it works. Different things are different, right? So an app that says prisons should be ended is not the same as an app that says, like this drug courts app that we have, that says, you know, an increased drug courts, right? Or another app that maybe advocates for community policing, right? Those are three very different actions, and they look very, very different from each other, right? When the affirmative stands up and says, you know, the resolution is bad, we have to abolish the entire criminal justice system, and we can't do that from within the federal government because it's, you know, the problematic reforms, whatever, it implicitly or oftentimes explicitly assumes that each of those different actions are the same thing, right? Or at least that they're so similar to each other that the differences among them don't matter. The purpose of the topic education impact is to say, no, those distinctions really, really do matter. And we should learn about the differences between them through debate, right? The more that we debate about different affirmatives, the more we can learn about them. And when we assume that all criminal justice policies are the same thing, that anytime that the federal government does anything involving criminal justice, it's just a kind of a weak side reform meant to sedate the population. And so we can't trust anything that they do, right? Then we no longer learn to focus on and learn about the important, intricate, different effects of each of those policies. So debating about those policies is good because we should know about the differences between them, because they are really, really different and have really, really different effects on people. So topic education from within the lens of the resolution, within the particulars of different policy actions, matters a lot. And topic education also, I think you can easily say it turns the case, right? For kind of two reasons. One is that whatever kind of theory or criticism that they're talking about, you should make the argument that that is particularized depending on different policies, right? So anti-Blackness within a drug courts affirmative looks way different than anti-Blackness within an AF that says, let's end the prison industrial complex, right? Anti-Blackness may be a part of both of those things, but it materially and physically has different effects on bodies. And so when we sidestep a model of debate that says we should learn about those intricacies, we start to then understand what those theories are in a kind of more generic, broad sense, as opposed to the particulars of it. So what I'm saying really is that their model of debate, the one that you are saying is bad, is less educational for understanding the intricacies of those theories than your own model of debate. I will also add that oftentimes non-topical teams will forward the argument that debates should be about theory versus theory, or rev v rev is sometimes how it's worded. So teams will sometimes say, like, you know, we should be able to read, debate should be about like Wilderson's theory broadly against, I don't know, like a radically queer pessimist critique or a radical feminist critique. Like those theory versus theories is how debate should work. And they're like, that's really educational because we're learning about different theories, how they interact with each other. I will tell you right now, as an academic, as someone who spends a whole lot of time reading a whole bunch of these different theories, that is substantially less educational and substantially less useful for praxis than debates about intricacies of different policies and intricacies of different theories interacting with those policies. Okay, so broadly speaking, Wilderson's critique, again, looks different. The intricacies of Wilderson's critique should look different depending on what different affirmatives are. And so really what I'm trying to say is those theory versus theory debates, you should say, look even better in the world where we were talking about different policies and how they differently materially affect people. And additionally, the problem with theory versus theory in the debate sense, so like, let's assume that what the non-topical team is saying is correct, that just theory versus theory is what we should learn about, and we should debate about those things. The problem is that in a debate sense, because of how competition works, the negative is forced to say the most radical, extreme, oftentimes terrible version of that theory, and that version becomes a lot less educational. So for example, for me to prove, if I'm debating a Wilderson F and I want to go for a queer theory critique, I have to say the literal opposite of that affirmative in order to prove competition, because otherwise the F is going to go for that perm, right? And they're going to say that they always already solved the critique in some way, in some fashion, right? Because we don't have a standard kind of normative goalpost for what the affirmative has to do. Right, and so I'm going to be forced to read just like the worst, most generic, basic version of queer theory against that Wilderson K, which means that we're not going to learn about the intricacies of those theories as they interact with each other, because there's a competitive incentive to win, right? When you're negative, you still want to win the debate, right? And so you're going to read what you can in order to win the debate. And so you're going to sidestep education for the purpose of how do I win this debate? And truthfully, it's just like we should have to debate about different methods and different theories in order to resolve different impacts. Because it's just like the world's really complicated. There are a whole bunch of terrible things happening. And so we should learn about anti-Blackness, but we should also learn about heteronormativity and patriarchy and capitalism and, you know, all of the different environmental destruction, whatever you want to use to fill in that blank there. But we should learn about all of those things, and we should learn about them from within the lens of the resolution, because we have been given this opportunity to debate about a topic for a whole year and learn about the really cool ways that it affects, or really important ways, I guess I should say, that it affects people. And so not only does topic education really, really matter, but your version of topic education matters a lot more than their version of topic education. Does all of that make sense? Does anyone have questions about the topic education impact? Okay, so I truthfully myself just don't find any other impacts very persuasive. You are welcome to disagree with me, but I will walk through what the 3 other really common ones are. People will often say switch side debate has an impact. Just like the practice of defending different topics means that we just become better people. I don't really know why or how that's true. Also, like you could do that from reading a book. I don't know why we need to debate in order to do that. And also, realistically, the ass education claims probably solve that better, right? Like if they are right, like for them to have even been able to forward the argument that like the system is just totally screwed, presupposes that they're going to be a lot better at saying that they teach us how to be better radicals or better people or whatever. That's basically what I'm trying to say. So I don't think switch side debate is very persuasive impact. See the political is something that people will say that when we as intellectuals decide to stop talking about state action, we then allow the radical right to go in and take over the state, which then means they get to pass really bad policies. They're materially worse. Problem is that I think it's probably already seated. Trump's in office. There's a whole bunch of terrible conservatives in a whole bunch of different local and national offices. We, fingers crossed, hopefully is moving more back towards the left, but I don't really think the political is very persuasive for that reason. And then the other impact that people will sometimes say is neoliberalism, which is just like we got to act within the state in order to get rid of neoliberalism. And the affirmative says we shouldn't talk about the state, and so they are trading off with our ability to learn about the state and learn about our ability to challenge neoliberalism. I don't really think that criminal justice reform policies would radically change how neoliberalism works. There are yeah, I'm gonna go with that. And then not many teams, this is becoming less true now, but not so many teams will universally say that the state is always already bad, and they'll have some kind of nuance for why they think they in particular should not be topical, but other teams can be topical. And so they get to say, yes, but you get that education other things. And so I don't think neolib is very persuasive for that reason. Does anyone have other impacts that they think are persuasive that they want me to talk through? Okay. So that's what I've got for the impact stuff. We'll talk about topical version now. I think that the topical version is probably the most important part of framework. And I think that's true because it is the best defense. Because if you win this, then there should be zero reason to lose the debate because it proves that they could have been topical and solved their entire case. And oftentimes it's really good offense, actually, because you get to say, actually, not only did we provide the equivalent education of what you're talking about, but rather we have a method that provides a better inroads to that education and has some external reason why we should prefer it. So I think that this really is where most of your pre-round prep should go, and I think you should spend a significant amount of time developing this. And that is kind of a less popular opinion. A lot of people want to say, that topical version is just like a really quick thing that you throw out there, and it's just to kind of say, oh, well, maybe you could have had some version of your theory from within the resolution, and then, maybe that would be okay. I think that you should think of the topical version almost like a counter plan that solves the entire affirmative, you're obviously not literally advocating the action. It's not literally a counter plan, but that's a good metaphor for thinking about it. Because if you then get that argument, then I think you can win the debate on G version alone. So I think there are two pieces of the topical version that you should try and win. Number one, you have to win that the state can be good in some instances, at least, right? Because if you don't win that the federal government can do anything good, then they will get to stand up and say, but the federal government is always evil, so we can't trust them, means your TPA isn't a good thing. But honestly, I think it's just such a low bar to win that the state has done some good things sometimes, right? You're not defending the entire state. Like, please do not stand up and say that the federal government is like always good, because it's not. Certainly has done so many terrible things, but like, you're just saying it can do some good things sometimes. Right? And so on a purely theoretical level, you need to be able to prove that the state can do good things sometimes. And luckily for you, your topical version will allow you to prove that, right? So if your topical version is a good thing, then it also proves that the state can do good things. So that's component one. Component two is that I think you want to have a very specific topical version. Ideally, it should be carded, but it doesn't have to be. But I think it would really, really help if it is. But I think you want it to be explicit and to some extent pretty utopian. And by that, I mean that you still want, obviously it needs to be topical, but you want it to be pretty radical to be able to suck up most of their offense. So for the best example I can think of was that on the climate change topic, which was a college topic a couple of years ago, a pretty common topical version argument was to have the United States federal government affirm its ecological debt, which basically means that the USFG, the United States, recognizes that we are the primary reason that global warming is happening, that environmental degradation is occurring, and so it is our primary responsibility to do whatever we can to try and stop those violences. So it would mandate that the government radically decarbonizes. It would mean that we would basically have to get rid of capitalism. We would have to suddenly, or we would start helping other countries develop greener technology, right? So since we've taken on most of the burden, we wouldn't expect other developing countries to have to take on that burden. And so the idea was, like, this is just such a radical different policy and a radical different way of thinking about policy that it actually literally does change how the state works, right? So even if the state is just like absolutely terrible right now, after this policy were to be implemented, that the US affirms its ecological debt, then it is forced to think in such a radically different way that it is no longer terrible, or it is at least radically better, I guess is how I should say that. This is what is, I like to refer to it as a paradigm shift. Paradigm, P-A-R-A-D-I-G-M, is, if you're not familiar with that word, paradigm is functionally a worldview, kind of like a mindset. So it's a way of how we approach things. And the idea is, you know, if the state implements a policy that is so radically different, then it will have to, in order to enact and in order to abide by that policy, it will have to then think about things so very differently. So in terms of this topic, USFG should end all anti-Black policing policies, right? Or end all sentencing of Black Panthers or any other Black activists, and just like mandate that those activists can never be charged for anything, right? That would materially force members of the state to interact with those people differently, right? So like if it is now literally against the law for the police to stop a Black activist, then the police just have no right, no legitimacy to commit any kind of anti-Black, any kind of material anti-Black violence against that Black activist, right? So even if, you know, that person is still, like, those police are still anti-Black, they still, you know, are problematic for various reasons, they are forced to stop doing violent actions, right? That certainly doesn't resolve all of anti-Blackness, don't get me wrong, but it is a literal material praxis that says you have to think about your job differently, right? You are required to think about your job differently. And the wonderful thing about the way the resolution is written, because it says establish substantial, I don't remember the exact wording, but basically like establish substantial criminal justice reform, doesn't only require negative results. So but it can also be a positive result. So there may be something like, I don't know, maybe you could require that the state enacts substantial protection for Black Lives Matter activists, as well as mandating that cops are just no longer allowed to police these activists. Or maybe you could mandate that the moment that a cop does stop one of those activists, they are immediately thrown in jail. Just like, no questions asked. Did it happen? Yes, jail. Right, do you see what I'm saying? There's kind of just this, the more radical you can make your policies, the easier it is for you to say, look, we have actually changed how things work. And then once you've got that inroads, you get to look at them and you get to look at the judge and say, all of the criticisms that you're talking about could be part and parcel of the resolution. So I think topical version is incredibly important and something really worth spending time on. And then the last thing I want to say for this subsection is don't forget, do it on the neg. Do it on the neg is just this idea that whatever the affirmative's criticism is, they could read it while they're negative, right? Your interpretation of the topic does not say that there should not be any critiques at all. If you are saying that there should not be any critiques at all, then you are wrong, right? So your interpretation does not say no critiques, but rather that critiques that are not defending federal government or defending critiques that are not defending topical federal government action should be read exclusively on the negative rather than on the affirmative. So what that does for you is to say, you can still get, you affirmative can still get all of the education that you want, you just get it in now 1/2 of your debates instead of all of them, right? There's no intrinsic reason why you need to be able to read this particular criticism in every single debate that you have, right? One of the things that I said before with topic education is that we should learn about a whole bunch of different things because the world's really complicated and different power structures interact with different bodies in different ways from within the resolution. And so, yeah, maybe we should have to learn about other things while we're debating. And maybe we should, on the affirmative, have to defend things that are not the exact same as what we'd say on the negative. So you could tell them, you could just read your critique on the neg and you'd still get your education. Okay. Questions? We have about 20 minutes left. I would prefer to use this time for questions. I have some more things I can talk about, but I would rather answer questions. So what do you got? Literally no questions at all. I have just explained framework that well that none of you have any questions. How would you counter the topical version as affirmative? You need to be able to say, you need to be able to have an intrinsic reason to your theory and your action that cannot be resolved within the resolution. And so it's tough because the easier way to counter the TVA as the affirmative is to go farther away from the resolution, right? If your app is just like, heteronormativity is terrible and it's real and it explains how the world works, but it doesn't explain how criminal justice reform works. It explains how I don't know, like the US military works, right? If your app is like about the US military outside of the country, then like a TVA probably doesn't solve that app because you can't really talk about criminal justice reform. I don't think really applies to military outside of this country. But the problem is then the less related to the topic that you are, the easier it is for the negative to win a limits disad or an education disad. So that's kind of what I got for you. Sorry, Lucy. Does that help at all? So you need reasons why you can't be topical. It needs to be intrinsic to your action and your theory. Generally, that means you stray farther away from the topic. But the problem with that is it becomes a lot easier for the negative to win their impacts then. But I'm actually really glad that you asked that because not only does that answer your question, but it's also an important strategy to think about when you are reading framework is that if you cannot win a TVA for some reason because the affirmative isn't actually about the topic, then winning your impacts is a lot easier, right? Because you then get to stand up and say, no, we should be talking about criminal justice reform. You are not talking about criminal justice reform. Therefore, go Nick. What should the AFS strategy be to answer limits and education impacts? Most affirmatives will have a counter interpretation that attempts to limit down what is still allowed. That still provides some kind of limit on the topic and still maintains that people are talking about the topic. I think the problem with that is twofold. One, it's never going to be as limiting as what the negatives interpretation is, and it's never going to be as specific to the topic as what the negatives interpretation is. So I don't think it's ever going to quite resolve those impacts as well. But that really is the real strategy is to say the AF has a counter interpretation. It solves limits and it solves the next limits and education claims to some extent. And then we have an external impact, right? An external reason why we could not be topical. So federal government is always anti-Black, topic is always heteronormative, something like that. And you weigh that as offense against what's being said. So you really think about it as like, it's almost like you're flipping sides where the counter interpretation from the affirmative is a counter plan and you've got a DA associated with it, where you're like, this counter plan doesn't solve the AF perfectly, but it solves it pretty well. And then we've got a DA that just outweighs whatever residual solvency deficits there are. That being said, negative, when you are reading framework and the affirmative does have a counter interpretation, you need to say that counter interpretation is one that does not actually resolve any of your offense. And based on how we've talked about the limits impact and the education impact, I think you should be able to get away with doing that because most of these counter interpretations tend to be pretty arbitrary. They may actually be limiting in some sense. So counter interpretation, the affirmative has to talk about the topic is limiting, right? Because now it doesn't mean, like the affirmative can now not stand up and say the military is bad. The affirmative has to stand up and say, talk about criminal justice reform. So it is limiting to some extent, but it is one that still does not maintain a situation where you get easy equitable link arguments, or you're also not learning about the intricacies of the topic. So you should stand up and say, no, that interpretation is still atrocious for debate. It still doesn't resolve any of the impacts that you're talking about. Someone has asked me to re-explain what the switch side debate impact is. The basic thesis of the switch side debate impact is that when we switch sides on things, we become less dogmatic, i.e. we force ourselves, when we like literally standing up and saying the opposite of the thing that we've said before means that we start to learn, we better internalize that there are intricacies of each side. And so we become less certain in our beliefs, we become less so sure that we are right about this one thing that we could never possibly understand how anyone could ever disagree with us. So like that kind of mindset becomes less likely, and that just kind of makes us better people is usually what is talked about. Sometimes people will say that that's a better educational practice. But like I said before, I think just saying talk about the topic is better educational practice. Does that make sense to you? Did I explain that well? I can try and re-explain switch side debate again if you want. Awesome. Other questions? Okay, well then, I'll talk about some tips and tricks for how I think how you can deploy framework more persuasively. And some of these are arguments, some of these are just like ways to think about framework. The first one is that you should have some emotion, right? Have some emotion, act like you care, right? A lot of framework teams will almost kind of shut down emotionally and act like robots, which is strange. And I'm not entirely sure why it always happens. I think part of it is that framework teams oftentimes will get kind of scared because they are worried that they are crossing into the ground of saying something really offensive. And there is oftentimes a fine line between making the non-offensive version and then the offensive version of arguments. But having confidence in what you're saying is really important for making sure that you can persuade your judge. But at the same time, you should not whine, like don't be a total jerk in a debate or anything like that. Understand that, the affirmative, while is not topical, likely has said some reasonable things, right? Like whatever their criticism is of how the world works is probably true, right? Like the world is anti-Black, the world is heteronormative, patriarchal, capitalist, right? And so you don't want to stand up and just completely dismiss everything they've ever said and just like be a total asshole. Like don't do that. But have some emotion, act like you care, and always try and kind of seize that like we are the reasonable, the middle ground, the right position. Other tip is that cross-ex of the 1AC tends to be really, really important because it's good for trying to figure out exactly what the AF does. A lot of times, this is not always true, but a lot of times non-topical affirmatives in the 1AC won't really actually explain what they're doing, and then they kind of pivot and shift based on how the debate goes to reformulate what that AF says and what it looks like. And so this is when you want to really try and hammer down what it is that they are saying, particularly what it is they are advocating and what that action looks like, how it materially or philosophically changes how the world works. And so this is a time when I think some clarification questions are okay. So like if you're debating for example, not all anti-Blackness teams will forward the argument that anti-Blackness is ontological. And so it may, if you're not sure if the 1AC has forwarded that argument or not, it may be worth it and crosses the 1AC to say, hey, just not entirely sure, do you all say anti-Blackness is ontological or not? And they'll be like, yes, here's why, or like, no, we don't, blah, 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 And so like sometimes, this is I think an instance when clarification questions are potentially very useful. And again, this is part of the be reasonable. They have forwarded an argument that is an argument, and so you should treat it like an argument and not be immediately dismissive of everything said. Third thing is you should make presumption level arguments because I guess kind of the flip side of what I just said is that oftentimes non-topical affirmatives won't really do very much. Oftentimes, they'll be like, here's the problem with the world, we should criticize it, right? Or here's the problem with the world, here we should problematize it and properly understand how we have gotten to where we are in order to then figure out what we can do next or something like that. But like you can be like, come on, like knowing how the world works doesn't mean we're going to fix it, right? Knowing how the world works doesn't mean that we're ever going to fix it. And there's like a whole bunch of different ways you can make presumption level arguments. Like my personal favorite one is to say that most of these affirmatives tend to be kind of mishmashes of different theorists within particular critical theory that disagree with each other. So this happens not all the time, but it happens more often than it should with anti-Blackness affirmatives, where teams will read evidence from one author and then evidence from another author and then evidence from another author and another author and another author. And all of those different theorists, when they're talking about Blackness or talking about anti-Blackness, are talking about similar phenomenon, but are talking about slightly different ones. And so if you know what they are talking about, and have like sat and thought about what their theories are saying, then you can stand up and be like, vote neg on presumption, because you don't actually know what voting af to affirm Blackness means in this instance, because it could mean this thing according to this author, or this thing according to this author, and this thing according to this other author that they have. And you know, there's not like a locus of what they do or something like that. But basically what I'm saying is like exploit presumption level arguments, and don't be afraid to just be like, look, this AF is not a material action, so it doesn't literally physically change how things work. Number 4 is, I actually think splitting the block on framework is a good idea. It's scary because it means that you're stuck with one strategy in the block, but the way my partner and I always did it, which I think was great, was that the 2NC would be the interpretation and the offense. So I would talk a lot about the impact portion, and then the 1NR would be entirely the topical version / state good / these presumption arguments. And the idea is that the more depth that you have on an argument, the more likely it is for you to win that, obviously. And because framework is, you really do have to win basically every part of it, and you have to win it in a very coherent and persuasive way. And I think this is more true of framework than it is for like a disadvantage or a counter plan. Because that is such a high bar and it is pretty difficult, I think it is not a bad idea to split the block on framework. I don't know, some people, like, I would guess some of you sitting at home right now are just like, eek, I can never do that, which, you know, fair enough. Not everyone agrees with me, but I think it's a good idea. And then my last tip / trick is to stay calm. Just like stay calm. I kind of think I've had this theme throughout the last couple minutes here is like, remember that they have said some reasonable things and some non-reasonable things. Remember that, you know, you're going to be told that your arguments are problematic in some way. You're going to be told that forwarding that the United States federal government could do anything productive at all is anti-Black. Just like it's going to happen, doesn't matter, no matter what. And just take a deep breath and realize that honestly, it's okay. Like, this is just the same way as how you debate against any other affirmative, except you're reading a different argument against this one. Things are not like so radically different that, you know, you need to panic and freak out. The more you freak out, the easier it is to lose. I mean, that's true of all debates really, but I think it's especially true when you're reading framework against a non-topical.